Hi everyone, welcome to Red Umbrella. I hope you're all doing well. Today I want to argue that Brian Griffin, despite being an animated dog, is one of the most psychologically interesting characters in television, and that if a psychologist were to sit down and observe his behavior across the series, they would find deep and consistent patterns in the way he sees himself, the way he relates to other people, and the way he deals with the harder parts of his life. But before we begin, I'd just like to kindly ask you all to subscribe. It's completely free and it really helps us improve the videos for this wonderful community we've managed to build. Anyway, that's enough. Let's begin. Brian's contradictory identity. There is something quietly unusual about Brian Griffin from the very first moment you meet him. He is a dog, a white, anthropomorphic dog who lives in the Griffin household in Quahog, Rhode Island. And yet, from the way he carries himself, the way he speaks, the way he moves through the world, he feels like the most human character in the entire show. He walks on two legs, he talks in full articulate sentences, he has opinions about politics and literature, he drinks dry martinis, he reads books, he drives a car, he argues with adults about ideas that most people would never bring up in casual conversation. On paper, Brian Griffin looks less like a family pet and more like a roommate who just happens to also be a dog. But that is exactly where things get interesting, because Brian is not a roommate, he is a dog. And the show never fully lets him forget that. No matter how sophisticated he becomes, no matter how many books he reads, or how many intelligent conversations he has, there is always something underneath all of that, which ties him back to what he actually is. He chases things sometimes. He reacts to certain sounds and smells the way a dog would. He has moments where his instincts take over and his composure drops away, just for a second, and the animal underneath the intellectual surfaces. He is, at the end of the day, a pet in the Griffin household. And that tension, the tension between being a fully functioning, thinking, feeling person and being a dog who lives in someone else's house, runs through everything Brian does across the entire series. A psychologist observing someone who lived in that kind of tension would likely pay a great deal of attention to how it affected that person's sense of identity. Identity is one of the most important things a psychologist looks at when they study someone's behavior and emotional life. It is the way a person understands who they are, where they fit in the world, and how they relate to the people around them. For most people, identity is something that develops slowly over time, shaped by experiences, relationships, and the way the world responds to them. For Brian, that process is complicated from the very beginning, because he is constantly navigating two very different versions of himself at the same time. One version is the intelligent, cultured, emotionally aware individual who can hold a conversation with anyone in the room. The other version is the dog who belongs to the Griffin family and who, in many ways, depends on them for his place in the world. In the early seasons of Family Guy, Brian is mostly presented as the calm, level-headed presence in the Griffin household. When Peter does something reckless or impulsive, Brian is often the one who steps in and tries to bring some sense and order back to the situation. When the family is falling apart over something, Brian is usually there to offer a perspective that no one else in the room is thinking about. He is the voice of reason. He is the one who sees things clearly. And in those early episodes, that role gives Brian a clear sense of purpose and a clear place in the family dynamic. He matters because he is the smart one. He is valued because he is the one who keeps things from going completely off the rails. That role, that function within the family, becomes a core part of how Brian understands himself in the world. But roles like that can also be limiting. When you are always the one who is supposed to be calm and reasonable, it can start to feel like that is the only thing people expect from you. It can feel like the moment you step outside of that role, the moment you show a different side of yourself, the people around you do not quite know what to do with it. And for Brian, that experience of being locked into a certain version of himself by the people who are closest to him is something that quietly builds tension over the course of the series. One of the episodes that reveals the most about Brian's relationship with his own identity is Brian Goes Back to College, which appears in season 4. In this episode, Brian decides to go back to Brown University to finish his degree. He had attended before, but he never completed it. The decision to return tells you something important about what Brian wants for himself. He does not just want to be the family dog who happens to be smart. He wants to be taken seriously in the human world. He wants a degree. He wants credentials. He wants proof that he belongs in the same intellectual spaces as the people around him. Going back to school is Brian's way of trying to close the distance between who he is on the inside and how the world sees him on the outside. The way the episode plays out is important to understand. Brian goes back to school, and he tries to get through his coursework, but the academic environment is challenging, and Brian struggles more than he expected. At one point, he ends up cheating on a test, and he does so with Peter's help. When they get caught, It is Peter who steps forward and takes the blame in order to protect Brian. The degree does not end up happening. Brian does not graduate. And that failure, quiet as it is in the larger context of the show, says a great deal about where Brian is emotionally. He tried to close the gap between who he is and who he wants to be, and it did not work out. The human world did not open up the way he hoped it would, and the fact that he had to cheat in order to even attempt to get there adds another layer of complexity to the whole experience. It raises the question of whether Brian truly believed he could succeed on his own, or whether some part of him already knew that the path he was on was going to be difficult. A psychologist would likely see that storyline as a small but very significant piece of evidence about how Brian's identity is shaped by his relationship with the world around him. Brian does not just want to be intelligent. He wants the world to recognize that intelligence. He wants it to mean something. He wants it to change the way people see him and the way he sees himself. And when the world does not give him that recognition, even in small ways, it reinforces a feeling that has been building in Brian's character from the beginning, which is the feeling of not fully belonging anywhere. This feeling of not belonging is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is one of the quieter but more persistent threads in Brian's emotional life. Brian is too human to be comfortable with his role as a simple family pet. He thinks too much, feels too much, and cares too much about the world around him to be satisfied with just existing in someone's house and being fed and walked. And at the same time, he is too much of a dog to be fully accepted in the human world. There are limits to where he can go and what he can do, and the people around him do not always treat him as an equal, no matter how intelligent he is. Sometimes they listen to him. Sometimes they value his opinion. And other times, they dismiss him entirely, as though he is just a dog and nothing more. And for Brian, that inconsistency is one of the things that makes his place in the world feel so uncertain. The way this plays out in Brian's day-to-day life on the show is subtle. It shows up in the small moments. The way Brian sometimes looks at the Griffin family with a kind of quiet frustration. The way he occasionally pulls back from conversations when he feels like no one is really hearing what he is saying. The way he pursues projects and goals with an intensity that suggests he is trying to prove something, not just to the world, but to himself. These are all signs of someone who is working very hard to feel at home in a life that does not always feel entirely like his own. It is also worth noting that Brian's identity is not static. It changes over the course of the series, sometimes in ways that are surprising. In the early seasons, Brian is mostly warm, grounded, and thoughtful. As the show progresses and more seasons pass, Brian becomes more complicated. He becomes more self-serving at times. He becomes more prone to hypocrisy and contradiction. He makes decisions that do not line up with the image he has carefully built for himself over the years. And all of that evolution suggests that the identity Brian has constructed, the smart, cultured, reasonable dog, is not as stable or as comfortable as it might look from the outside. It is something Brian is constantly working to maintain, and sometimes it cracks under the pressure of everything else he is carrying inside. The Griffin family itself plays a meaningful role in shaping Brian's sense of identity. Peter sees Brian as a companion, sometimes a friend, sometimes an annoyance, and the way Peter's attention shifts between affection and indifference affects how Brian feels about his place in the household. Lois sees him as part of the family in her own way, and there is a warmth between them, though their relationship does not tend to go very deep emotionally. Meg and Chris interact with Brian in ways that change depending on the episode and the situation. And Stewie, who we will talk about in much more detail later in this video, has a relationship with Brian that is one of the deepest and most emotionally meaningful in the entire show. Each of these relationships puts a different kind of pressure on Brian's sense of who he is. Each one asks something different of him, and navigating all of those expectations at the same time, while also trying to figure out his own place in the world, is a great deal for any individual to handle. What a psychologist would ultimately observe about Brian's identity is that it is built on a foundation of contradiction. He is a dog who wants to be human. He is a pet who wants to be respected as an individual. He is someone who craves belonging and at the same time finds full belonging very difficult to achieve. And that contradiction does not disappear or get neatly resolved. It stays with Brian throughout the series, quietly shaping the way he feels, the way he behaves, and the way he relates to everyone and everything around him. Understanding that contradiction is the first and most important step toward understanding everything else about who Brian Griffin is. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. The identity tension that Brian carries with him every single day does not stay hidden beneath the surface for long, and the emotions it stirs up begin to come through in some of the show's quieter and more personal moments. Section 2. Emotional complexity and vulnerability. If you watch Family Guy casually, Brian Griffin might seem like a pretty even-keeled character. He is calm most of the time. He is composed. He carries himself with a kind of quiet confidence that makes him feel steady and reliable compared to the rest of the Griffin household. Peter is loud and impulsive. Stewie, especially in the earlier seasons, is chaotic and unpredictable. Lois is often reacting to the chaos around her. Meg and Chris are caught up in their own struggles, and Brian is the one who stays grounded through all of it. So on the surface, Brian looks like someone who has his emotions under control. He looks like someone who has figured out how to move through the world without being shaken by it too much. He looks settled. He looks like he has things figured out. But that impression is not the full picture. And the longer you spend watching Brian across the series, the more you start to see the cracks in that composed exterior. Because underneath all of that calmness, Brian is carrying a great deal. He experiences sadness, insecurity, frustration, and a deep longing for connection that does not always get satisfied. These emotions are real, and they are present in Brian's character across many episodes throughout the series. They do not always show up in loud or dramatic ways. A lot of the time, they are quiet. They live in the pauses, in the small moments, in the way Brian holds himself during a conversation, in the way he responds when he thinks no one is paying close attention to him. But they are there, and a psychologist watching Brian closely would notice them very quickly. The show builds these emotional layers gradually. It does not dump them all on the audience at once. Instead, over the course of many episodes and many seasons, the writers give Brian small moments that reveal what is going on inside him. A flicker of disappointment. A pause that lasts just a little too long. A decision that does not quite line up with the version of himself he shows the world. These moments are easy to miss if you are not looking for them. And that is part of what makes them so interesting from a psychological perspective. Brian's emotional life is something you have to pay attention to in order to see. It does not announce itself. One of the clearest examples of Brian's emotional vulnerability comes from the way his atheism affects his life in the world of the show. Brian is an atheist. He does not believe in God, and he has been open about that throughout the series. In Quahog, a town where religion plays a significant role in how people connect with each other and form their social bonds, Brian's lack of belief makes him stand out. He is different from most of the people around him in a way that matters to them. And that difference can carry real consequences in his daily life. It is the kind of thing that affects not just how Brian sees himself, but how the people around him treat him. In the episode Believe It or Not, I Believe, which is in Season 7, Brian writes a book about atheism. The book gets attention, and it does not go over well with the people in Quahog. Brian becomes someone that the community looks at differently. People begin to pull away from him. There is pushback, and it is personal. The town makes Brian feel like his worldview, the way he genuinely sees and understands the world, is something that sets him apart in a negative way. And that experience hits Brian in a place that runs very deep, because Brian has spent so much of his life trying to present himself as someone who is thoughtful, articulate, and worthy of respect. He has worked hard to build that image. And then in this storyline, he finds out that holding a certain set of beliefs can unravel all of that work in a short amount of time. What makes this storyline psychologically interesting is not just the fact that Brian faces rejection from the people around him. It is the way that rejection lands on him emotionally and what it reveals about where Brian's sense of self-worth actually comes from. Brian likes to carry himself as someone who is independent. Someone who thinks for himself and does not need everyone to agree with him in order to feel okay about who he is. But when the people around him actually respond negatively to his ideas, when they treat him like he is someone to be avoided rather than someone to be listened to, the effect is real and visible. He feels the sting of it. He internalizes it. And it adds to a quiet weight that Brian has been carrying for a long time, which is the feeling that no matter how hard he tries to be accepted for who he truly is, there is always something about him that the world around him does not fully embrace. The atheism storyline does not create that feeling in Brian. It simply brings it closer to the surface. This pattern of emotional vulnerability also shows up in the way Brian relates to the people closest to him on a day-to-day basis. Brian does not tend to open up about what he is feeling in a big, obvious way. He does not sit someone down and have a long, honest conversation about the things that are bothering him. Instead, his feelings come out in smaller and more indirect ways. They show up in the decisions he makes. They show up in the way he treats the people around him on a given day. They show up in the slight shifts in his behavior that most of the other characters in the show do not even register. This is actually a very recognizable way of processing emotion. A lot of people who are dealing with difficult feelings do not express them directly or out loud. They carry them quietly, and those feelings influence everything they do without ever being named or acknowledged in conversation. Brian fits this pattern very closely. There is also a loneliness in Brian's emotional life that is worth taking time to sit with and understand. Brian lives in a house with 5 other family members. He is never physically alone. He is always surrounded by people, always in the middle of something, always part of whatever is happening in the Griffin household on any given day. And yet, emotionally, Brian often feels isolated. He does not always feel truly seen or understood by the people he lives with. Peter is often too caught up in his own interests and his own impulses to notice what Brian might be going through on any given day. Lois is kind to Brian, and there is genuine warmth between them, but their relationship tends to stay on a fairly surface level when it comes to emotional depth. They do not tend to have the kinds of conversations where Brian opens up about what is really weighing on him. Meg and Chris have their own struggles and their own complicated dynamics with the family, and Brian is not always at the center of those conversations. The result is that Brian can be in the middle of a crowded room and still feel like he is carrying something entirely on his own, without anyone around him fully realizing the weight of it. A psychologist would describe this kind of experience as emotional isolation, and it is something that can affect a person in deep and lasting ways over time. It does not matter that Brian has people around him at almost all times. What matters is whether those people actually understand what he is feeling on the inside. And in a lot of cases, they simply do not. Brian is the one who understands everyone else. He is the one who observes and reflects and tries to make sense of the chaos that surrounds him every single day. And very rarely does anyone in the Griffin household turn the attention back toward him and check in on how he is actually doing. The emotional labor Brian puts in for the people around him is rarely returned in the same way. The show also gives Brian moments where his emotions come to the surface in ways that are directly tied to guilt and regret. When Brian realizes that something he said or did has caused pain to someone he cares about, the way he handles that guilt is very telling. He does not brush it off. He does not crack a joke about it and move on to the next thing. He sits with it. It affects his mood. It changes the way he behaves for a stretch of time afterward. Sometimes it changes the way he approaches a relationship that has been damaged by something he did. And that tells you something important about Brian as a character. It tells you that he genuinely cares about the people in his life, even when his actions do not always line up with that care. The gap between what Brian wants to be and what he actually does in a given moment is one of the deeper sources of his emotional tension, and it creates a kind of internal conflict that does not resolve itself easily or quickly. Brian's emotional life is also shaped by how aware he is of the passage of time and the way life changes around him. Brian notices things. He pays attention to the way the world moves forward, to the way the people around him grow and shift and become different versions of themselves over time. And he reflects on what that means for his own life in ways that most of the other characters in the show simply do not. This awareness gives Brian a kind of emotional depth that is unusual for an animated character. He is not just reacting to what is happening in front of him in the moment. He is thinking about it, sitting with it, feeling the weight of it in a way that comes through in his behavior, even when he does not say anything about it out loud. There is something melancholic about the way Brian moves through the world that a psychologist would find worth examining closely. Brian is not in a constant state of sadness. He has moments of happiness, moments of satisfaction, moments where things feel okay and life feels manageable. But there is a sadness that runs through his character like a thread, a quiet awareness that things in his life are not quite the way he wants them to be. His dreams have not fully come together the way he imagined they would. His relationships have not always given him what he was hoping for. His place in the world feels uncertain in ways that he cannot always control or change. And all of that creates a kind of low-level emotional weight that Brian carries with him from one episode to the next, even during the moments when life seems to be going fine on the surface. What all of this adds up to is a character with a genuinely complex and layered emotional interior. Brian is not just sad, or just lonely, or just frustrated. He is all of those things at different points in the series, and sometimes several of them at once. His emotions are layered on top of each other in ways that do not simplify neatly into a single feeling or a single explanation. A psychologist would describe someone like this as emotionally rich, someone whose inner life is full and active and influential in the way they move through the world, even when the people around them have no real idea what is actually going on beneath the surface. The way Brian manages those emotions, or the way he struggles to manage them when they become too much to carry quietly, becomes much clearer when you start looking at some of the specific strategies he uses to get through the harder moments of his life. And one of those strategies is something the show has returned to again and again, quietly and consistently across many seasons of the series, in a way that says a great deal about what Brian is going through on the inside. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. The way Brian reaches for something to take the edge off when life starts to feel like too much connects directly to one of the most quietly revealing and recurring patterns across his entire character. Section 3. Alcohol use and coping. Brian Griffin drinks. This is one of the most consistent and recognizable things about him across the entire run of Family Guy. From the very early seasons, Brian is shown with a martini in his hand or nearby, a dry martini specifically. It becomes almost like a signature, something that is just part of who Brian is, something that follows him through scene after scene and episode after episode. You see it in casual moments at home. You see it during conversations with the family. You see it when Brian is relaxing, when he is thinking, when he is just sitting in the Griffin living room and watching the world go by. The martini is there, quietly and reliably. And after a while, it becomes one of the first things you associate with Brian as a character. The first time you see it, it registers as a small detail, a character trait, something that adds a little bit of flavor to the way Brian presents himself to the world. He is the sophisticated one. He is the cultured one. Of course he drinks martinis. It makes sense alongside everything else about the way Brian carries himself, and in those early moments, that is mostly how it reads. It is a piece of the puzzle that makes Brian feel like a complete and well-defined character. But that first impression is only part of the story, because if you start paying attention to the pattern of when Brian drinks and how often he reaches for a glass, something more significant begins to take shape over the course of the series. Brian does not just drink because he enjoys the taste of a good martini, or because it fits the version of himself he wants to present to the world. He drinks because it helps him cope. It helps him get through the parts of his life that feel difficult, uncomfortable, or frustrating. And the show, over the course of many seasons, makes it clear that Brian's relationship with alcohol is not as casual or as lighthearted as it might first appear. It is something deeper, and it is something that affects the way Brian moves through his life in real and meaningful ways. A psychologist observing this pattern would likely note that Brian's drinking serves a specific emotional function. When Brian is stressed, when he is disappointed, when he is dealing with a situation that makes him feel small or unvalued or stuck, a drink seems to be one of the first things he reaches for. It is not always a dramatic moment. It does not always look like a crisis from the outside. Brian is not stumbling around or losing control in most of the scenes where he is drinking. He is still composed. He is still articulate. He still functions the way everyone expects him to function. He still holds conversations. He still carries himself with that same quiet confidence he always has. On the surface, nothing looks wrong. Brian looks fine. He looks like he has everything handled. But the frequency with which he turns to alcohol and the way it seems to soften the rough edges of his emotional experience tells a psychologist something important about how Brian has learned to handle the harder parts of his life. The martini is doing work that Brian is not doing in any other way, and the gap between how Brian appears on the outside and what is actually happening on the inside is one of the most interesting things about the way the show portrays him. The Griffin household itself plays a significant role in the way Brian's drinking has developed and continued over the years. Peter Griffin drinks beer constantly. It is one of the most defining and consistent things about Peter as a character. He drinks at home, he drinks at the bar, he drinks in the middle of the afternoon on a weekday, and no one in the household ever really questions it or treats it as something unusual or concerning. It is simply part of the way life works in the Griffin home. Alcohol is present. It is normal. It is expected. Peter and Brian in many ways share a kind of unspoken understanding about drinking. They are both doing it regularly in the same house, and neither one of them treats it as something that needs to be examined or talked about. That shared dynamic makes the drinking feel even more ordinary than it might in a different kind of household. This kind of environment is something a psychologist would pay a great deal of attention to. When the people around someone do not challenge a pattern of behavior, it becomes much easier for that pattern to continue without ever being examined or questioned. Brian can pour a martini at any point during the day in any kind of situation, and no one in his immediate world is going to raise an eyebrow or ask him if he is all right. The drinking just continues, quietly and consistently, because the environment Brian lives in makes it possible for that to happen without anyone noticing or saying anything about it. The normalization of alcohol in the Griffin household is not something Brian created on his own. It was already there when he was living in that house, and it makes it much easier for Brian to keep doing what he has been doing without ever having to look at it honestly, or consider what it might actually be telling him about the way he is handling his life. There are moments in the series where the show does pull back the curtain a little and lets the audience see Brian's relationship with alcohol in a less flattering light. There are scenes where other characters acknowledge that Brian drinks more than he probably should. When those moments happen, there is a slight shift in the tone of the scene. It feels a little different from the usual comedic treatment. It feels like the show is pausing, just for a moment, to let the audience see something they might have been skimming past without realizing it. These moments are sometimes played for a laugh, and sometimes they carry a little more weight than that. They are the show's way of signaling to the audience that what has been treated as a small, humorous detail is actually something worth noticing and paying attention to. Brian has a problem, and the people around him are at least occasionally aware of it, even if they do not always do anything meaningful about it or follow up on the concern they might feel in a given moment. What makes Brian's drinking particularly interesting from a psychological standpoint is the relationship between the drinking and his self-image. Brian sees himself as a thoughtful, intellectual, put-together individual. He values sophistication. He values the idea that he is someone who approaches life with a certain level of grace and awareness. He has built that image carefully over time, and it is something he holds on to tightly. And alcohol, specifically a martini, actually fits very neatly into that self-image. A martini feels cultured, it feels refined. It feels like something a writer or a thinker would drink at the end of a long day. So Brian's drinking does something double. It helps him manage his emotions on the inside, and at the same time, it reinforces the version of himself that he wants the world to see on the outside. A psychologist might observe that this makes Brian's drinking particularly difficult to challenge or change because it is not just a coping mechanism. It is also wrapped up in something Brian values deeply about who he is and how he sees himself. There is also something worth examining about the way Brian's drinking interacts with his tendency to keep his emotions to himself. Brian, as we explored in the previous section, does not tend to express what he is feeling in an open or direct way. He internalizes things, he carries them quietly, he does not sit down with someone and talk about what is bothering him or what he is going through. Alcohol fits very naturally into that pattern of behavior. It is something Brian can use without drawing attention to himself, without admitting that he is struggling, and without ever having to put into words what is actually going on inside him. He can manage his emotions through the glass without anyone around him needing to know that he is managing them at all. The martini becomes a private space, a quiet and socially acceptable way of dealing with feelings that Brian has no interest in sharing out loud. A psychologist would also likely note that Brian's drinking seems to become more present during the periods of his life when other things are not going well. When his writing is not coming together the way he hoped it would. When a relationship has ended or is in the process of falling apart. when Brian feels like the world is not giving him what he deserves or what he has worked for. In those stretches of time, the martini becomes a little more central to his day. It becomes a little more necessary. You can feel it in the way Brian carries himself during those episodes. The glass is closer. The drinking is quieter and more constant. And that connection between Brian's emotional state and his use of alcohol tells you something important about what is really driving the pattern. The drinking is not random. It is not just a habit that Brian has never thought about. It is a response to something. It is Brian's way of dealing with the gap between how he wants his life to feel and how it actually feels on a given day. The episodes where Brian does attempt to step back from drinking, or where the show forces him to look at his relationship with alcohol more honestly, are revealing in their own way. In those storylines, Brian often finds it very difficult to move away from the habit entirely. He may try for a while. He may make a genuine effort to change the way he is approaching things. And for a short stretch of time, he may succeed in pulling back. But the pull of the pattern and the emotional comfort that alcohol provides tend to bring him back. A psychologist would recognize this as something very common among people who have developed a reliance on a substance to help them get through difficult emotions. It is often not about willpower. It is about the fact that the substance is genuinely filling a role in the person's emotional life that nothing else has filled in the same way. The martini is doing something for Brian that nothing else in his life has fully replaced. This is an important distinction to sit with for a moment. Brian's drinking is not simply about him being flawed or broken in some obvious way. It is about the fact that Brian has found something that makes the harder parts of his life feel more manageable. And giving that up would mean facing those harder parts in a completely different way. It would mean finding another way to deal with the frustration, the loneliness, the feeling of not quite measuring up to the standards Brian has set for himself. And for someone who already struggles with feelings of inadequacy and self-doubt on a regular basis, that is not a simple thing to do. It requires a kind of vulnerability and honesty with himself that Brian has spent a long time learning to avoid. The martini is a band-aid. It covers the wound without healing it. And as long as Brian keeps reaching for it, the things underneath, the loneliness, the insecurity, the sense of not quite fitting in, continue to sit there, unaddressed and quietly growing, waiting for Brian to find a way to look at them directly. Understanding the role alcohol plays in Brian's emotional life opens up a wider and deeper view of how Brian relates to the other people in his world, and particularly to the romantic relationships that have meant the most to him across the series. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. The same insecurity and quiet fear of not being enough that drives Brian toward the glass also follows him into the relationships where he lets someone close enough to see who he really is. Section 4. Relationships and insecurity. Brian Griffin has had a number of romantic relationships throughout the course of Family Guy, and if you look at them as a group, a pattern starts to take shape. These relationships do not tend to last very long. They often end in conflict, in misunderstanding, or in Brian pulling back before things can get too serious or too real. And the reasons why they fall apart are not always immediately obvious when you are watching them unfold. Brian is charming in his own way. He is articulate, he is kind, at least some of the time. He genuinely seems to want to connect with another person on a deeper level. So the question a psychologist would naturally start asking is why, given all of that, Brian's romantic life keeps ending up the same way. Why does the pattern repeat itself over and over again, even when Brian clearly does not want it to? The answer, when you start looking at it closely, has a lot to do with insecurity. Brian carries a significant amount of self-doubt into every relationship he enters, and that self-doubt does not always show up in the way you might expect it to. Sometimes it looks like nervousness or hesitation, but other times it looks like overconfidence. It looks like Brian pulling back at exactly the moment when a relationship starts to feel real and serious and demanding. It looks like Brian making a decision that pushes someone away, not because he does not care about them, but because some part of him does not fully trust that the good thing he has is going to last. A psychologist would recognize this as a very common pattern in people who have spent a long time feeling unsure of their own worth. The insecurity does not disappear just because Brian has entered a relationship. It follows him into it, and it quietly influences almost everything he does while he is in it. One of the most significant and longest-running romantic relationships in Brian's history on the show is his relationship with Jillian Russell. Jillian is a recurring character across several seasons of Family Guy. She is portrayed as a young woman who is sweet and well-meaning, though she is not on the same intellectual level as Brian. Their relationship has a comedic quality to it on the surface. The mismatch between Brian's cultured, thoughtful personality and Jillian's more naive and open way of seeing the world creates moments that are funny to watch. The show leans into that contrast for laughs, and it works. But underneath all of that humor, there is something real happening between them. Brian genuinely cares about Jillian. The relationship matters to him in a way that goes beyond the comedic dynamic. It is not just a joke or a running gag that the writers return to for easy laughs. It is a storyline that the show returns to and develops over time, and the way it develops reveals a great deal about how Brian operates when he is emotionally invested in another person. The early stages of Brian and Jillian's relationship are worth paying attention to because they show what Brian looks like when he is hopeful about someone. There is a period where Brian feels good about where things are going, where being with Jillian feels like it could be something meaningful and lasting. Brian allows himself to feel that hope, and that in itself is significant because hope requires a certain amount of trust in the future, and trust is not something that comes easily to someone who carries as much quiet doubt as Brian does. The fact that Brian lets himself feel hopeful at all tells you that the relationship is touching something real inside him. The dynamic between Brian and Jillian is interesting to observe because it exposes some of the things Brian struggles with most in romantic situations. On one hand, Brian feels a genuine pull toward Jillian. He enjoys being with her. He values her presence in his life. On the other hand, there is a part of Brian that struggles with the relationship, not because of anything Jillian does wrong, but because of the way Brian's own insecurities interact with the closeness that a real relationship requires. Being close to someone means being vulnerable. It means letting another person see parts of yourself that you might not want anyone to see. And for Brian, who has spent so much of his life carefully constructing an image of who he is and how he wants to be perceived by the world, that kind of vulnerability is genuinely uncomfortable. It goes against the grain of everything Brian has built for himself over the years. When the relationship with Jillian eventually falls apart, Brian's emotional response is not something he brushes off or moves past quickly. The ending of that relationship affects him in a real and visible way. It leaves a mark on him. And the way Brian processes the loss tells you something important about what romantic relationships actually mean to him on an emotional level. For Brian, losing a relationship is not just about losing a partner, or losing companionship, or losing someone to spend time with. It is about losing something that confirmed a certain thing about himself. It is about losing proof that he is someone who can be loved, someone who is worthy of being chosen by another person, and who deserves to be chosen. That is a heavy thing to carry, and it shapes the way Brian approaches romantic situations going forward, long after the specific relationship has ended. Brian's broader pattern of romantic failure is worth examining on its own, separate from any single relationship he has been in. Across the series, Brian has pursued a number of different women, and the outcomes of those pursuits tend to follow a similar shape. There is an initial period where Brian feels hopeful, where the possibility of connection feels real and exciting and worth pursuing. And then, as things progress and the relationship starts to demand more emotional honesty from Brian, something shifts. Brian pulls back. He becomes guarded. He becomes a little more distant in ways that the other person in the relationship can feel, even if Brian does not always acknowledge it himself. He makes choices that create space between himself and the other person, sometimes without fully realizing why he is doing it in the moment. A psychologist would likely describe this as a pattern of emotional self-protection. Brian has learned, over time, that letting someone in fully also means opening himself up to the possibility of being hurt in a real and painful way. And for someone who already carries a fragile sense of self-worth, that possibility can feel overwhelming. The way Brian handles it is not to stop wanting connection. He still wants it. He still reaches for it. He still lets himself feel drawn to people in ways that matter to him. But he also builds small walls along the way. Small moments of pulling back, or creating space, or shifting his attention that keep the relationship from ever reaching a point where Brian would be completely and fully exposed to another person. The insecurity that drives this pattern is not something Brian wears openly or talks about. He is too proud for that. and his self-image as a confident, intellectual individual does not leave a lot of room for openly admitting that he feels unsure of himself when it comes to love and closeness. So instead, the insecurity comes through in his behavior in quieter and more subtle ways. It shows up in the way Brian sometimes doubts whether the person he is with actually wants to be with him in the way he hopes they do. It shows up in the way he can become withdrawn when things start to feel too serious too quickly. It shows up in the decisions Brian makes that, on the surface, might seem like they are about something else entirely, but underneath are really about Brian's fear of not being enough for another person. There is also something worth noticing about the types of romantic situations Brian tends to find himself in. There is often an imbalance present in some form. Brian might be the more intellectually sophisticated one in the relationship. He might be the one who is putting in more emotional effort than the other person. He might be the one who feels like he has more to lose if things go wrong. This kind of imbalance can actually feel comfortable to someone who struggles with vulnerability, because it keeps Brian in a position where he feels at least somewhat in control of the dynamic. If Brian is always the one who is slightly above the relationship in some way, he does not have to fully expose himself to the risk of being on completely equal footing with another person, where the possibility of rejection feels more real and more immediate and more threatening. The way Brian responds when rejection actually comes, whether it is direct or indirect, is also revealing. When Brian feels like he has been rejected or overlooked by someone he cares about, his reaction tends to be a mix of hurt and frustration. The hurt comes from the personal sting of feeling unwanted. The frustration comes from the conflict between how Brian sees himself and the fact that someone has, in some way, told him that he is not what they are looking for. These two feelings together create an emotional experience that Brian does not always handle in the healthiest way. Sometimes he becomes withdrawn. Sometimes he becomes irritable or short with the people around him. Sometimes the feelings bleed over into other areas of his life and affect the way he treats the people who have nothing to do with the romantic situation at hand. There is also a thread of regret that runs through Brian's romantic history that is worth paying attention to. Brian has had moments across the series where he looks back on a relationship that did not work out and realizes, sometimes with a delay, that he could have handled things differently, that the way he pulled back or the way he let his own insecurity make decisions for him cost him something he actually wanted and something that mattered to him. This kind of regret is significant because it shows that Brian is aware, on some level, of the patterns he falls into. He can see, after the fact, that his fear and his self-doubt shaped the way things ended up. And yet, being aware of a pattern and being able to change it are two very different things. And for Brian, the gap between those two things remains. What Brian's romantic relationships ultimately reveal is a character who desperately wants to be loved and accepted by another person, and who at the same time is genuinely afraid of what being fully vulnerable requires. He wants the closeness. He wants the feeling of being truly known by someone. He wants someone to choose him and to keep choosing him. And he also wants to protect himself from the pain that could come if all of that were taken away. These two desires pull Brian in opposite directions, and they have never fully resolved themselves in his favor. The insecurity that shapes Brian's love life does not stay neatly contained within his romantic relationships. It reaches into other parts of his life as well, particularly the way Brian thinks about his own mind, his own abilities, and the value he believes he brings to the world around him. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. The same quiet fear of not being enough that haunts Brian's romantic life also finds its way into the way he sees his own intelligence and the worth he believes it gives him in the eyes of the world. Section 5. Intelligence, Self-Perception, and Ego. Brian Griffin has always carried himself as someone who is smarter than the people around him. This is one of the foundational things about his character, and it has been present from the very beginning of the series. He reads. He writes. He has opinions about politics, about literature, about philosophy, about the way the world works and the way it should work. He drinks dry martinis and speaks in complete, well-constructed sentences. Everything about the way Brian presents himself to the world suggests that he is the intellectual of the Griffin household, and for a long time, the show seems to support that idea without question. Brian is the one who knows things. Brian is the one who can be relied upon to offer a thoughtful, reasoned perspective when everyone else is just reacting to whatever chaos is happening in front of them. He is the one who has read the books, who has thought about the ideas, and who feels comfortable sharing what he thinks about them. In the early seasons especially, that intellectual identity feels like one of the most stable and appealing things about Brian. When you first start watching the show, Brian is the character who makes you feel like someone in the Griffin household has things figured out. He is calm, he is measured, he seems to understand the world in a way that Peter, Lois, and the rest of the family simply do not. And that understanding feels genuine. It feels like Brian has earned his place as the smart one through years of reading and thinking and paying attention to the world around him. The audience receives him as trustworthy, as someone whose perspective is worth listening to. And for a stretch of the early series, that trust feels well placed. But as the series continues, the show starts to complicate that image in ways that are worth paying attention to. Brian's intelligence is real. There is no question about that. He is genuinely curious about the world, and he engages with ideas in a way that the other members of the Griffin family generally do not. He thinks about things. He reflects on things. He cares about the life of the mind in a way that makes him stand out in his household. But the way Brian relates to his own intelligence is not always as healthy or as straightforward as it might first appear. And a psychologist looking at his behavior would notice that Brian's self-perception as an intellectual is as much about his ego as it is about his actual intellectual ability. The intelligence is there. The ego that surrounds it and sometimes overshadows it is also there. And the two of them do not always work together in a way that serves Brian well. Brian fancies himself a writer. This is one of the more defining aspects of his character across the series. Writing is something Brian takes seriously, and it is something he has invested a great deal of hope and identity into over the years. He has worked on novels. He has written other creative pieces. His novel, Citizen Dog, is one example of a project that Brian pours himself into, believing that it represents something meaningful about who he is and what he has to say to the world. Writing, for Brian, is not just a hobby or something he does in his spare time. It is a core part of how he sees himself. It is the thing that makes him feel like he has purpose, like he has something to contribute, like he is more than just a dog living in someone else's house. When Brian is working on something creative, there is a kind of quiet intensity to the way he approaches it. He takes it seriously in a way that he does not always take other things seriously. He invests himself emotionally in the work. He cares about whether it is good, whether it says what he wants it to say, and whether the people who read it are going to understand and appreciate what he has put into it. That level of emotional investment is significant because it tells you that writing is not just something Brian does, it is something Brian needs. He needs it to feel like he is contributing something meaningful to the world, and he needs it to work out in order for his sense of himself to feel solid and real. The problem is that Brian's writing career does not always go the way he hopes it will. There are stretches in the series where Brian's creative work does not get the recognition or the response he was expecting. Projects fall flat. The world does not always receive what Brian has written with the same enthusiasm that Brian felt when he was writing it. And when that happens, the disappointment Brian feels is not just about the creative project itself. It is about something deeper. It is about Brian's sense of who he is and whether that sense is actually supported by the evidence the world is giving him. When the writing does not work out, it does not just feel like a professional setback. It feels like a personal one because Brian has put so much of his identity into the idea of being a writer that a failure in his writing life feels like a failure in his life as a whole. A psychologist would likely observe that Brian's relationship with his writing reveals something important about the way he handles ambition and self-worth. Brian does not just write because he loves writing, although that love is genuinely there. He also writes because he needs to write. He needs the writing to work out in order for his self-image to feel solid. He needs the writing to succeed, because success in that area would confirm what Brian already believes about himself, which is that he is intelligent, that he has something valuable to say, and that the world should care about what he thinks and what he creates. When the writing succeeds, even a little, Brian feels good about himself. And when it does not, something in Brian's foundation shakes. There is also an element of pretension in the way Brian sometimes carries his intellectual side, and this is something the show acknowledges with a degree of honesty. Brian can come across as a little too proud of what he has been reading, a little too eager to share his opinions on things that the people around him have not thought about or do not particularly care about. In scenes where Brian is being pretentious, There is a quality to the way he speaks that sets him apart from the rest of the conversation. He uses words and references that no one else in the room is going to catch. He brings up topics that feel slightly out of place in the middle of an ordinary conversation. And he does all of this with a kind of quiet confidence that suggests he knows he is the only person in the room who is thinking about these things, and that he is comfortable with that fact. The show plays this for laughs sometimes, having other characters push back on Brian's need to be the smartest and most cultured person in any given room. But underneath the humor, there is something worth examining. The pretension is not just Brian being annoying or out of touch. It is Brian doing something specific for himself emotionally. It is Brian using his intellectual identity as a way of keeping other people at a slight distance, a way of maintaining a position in the world where he feels safe and in control. A psychologist might describe this as a form of emotional defense. If Brian can establish himself as the smartest, most thoughtful, most aware person in any situation, then he does not have to worry as much about whether he is valued for other reasons. His intelligence becomes a shield. It keeps people from getting too close, because Brian is always slightly above them, always looking at the world from a position that feels elevated and secure. And that distance, even though it might not feel like distance from the inside, is a way of protecting Brian from the vulnerability that comes with being seen as an equal, someone who could be rejected or overlooked without the safety net of being smarter than everyone else in the room. One of the moments in the series that most directly addresses Brian's relationship with his own intelligence and self-worth involves Brian taking the SATs. Brian decides to take the test, and the expectation going into it, both from Brian and from the audience, is that he is going to do well. His self-image is closely tied to the idea that he is smart and capable, and the SATs feel like they should be an opportunity to prove that on paper, in a way that the world can see and acknowledge. Brian is confident going into it. He feels like this is going to be the thing that confirms what he already knows about himself. When the scores come back and they are not what Brian expected, the effect on him is significant. It is not just a moment of mild disappointment that passes quickly. It shakes something in Brian that he has been relying on, which is the belief that his intelligence is solid, that it is real, and that it will always be there to hold him up when other things in his life feel uncertain. What makes this moment psychologically interesting is what it reveals about the relationship between Brian's intelligence and his sense of self-worth. For Brian, being smart is not just a trait he happens to have. It is the foundation of who he is. It is the thing that separates him from the other members of the Griffin family. It is the thing that makes him feel like he has a place in the world, a reason to be respected and taken seriously by the people around him. So when that foundation is challenged even a little, it does not just affect Brian's confidence in the moment. It affects his entire sense of identity. It makes him feel less certain about who he is and what he is worth. And that uncertainty does not go away quickly or easily. The way Brian's ego and his self-doubt coexist is actually one of the most psychologically realistic things about his character. In real life, people who struggle with self-worth often develop a strong and very visible sense of ego as a way of compensating for the doubt they feel underneath. They build up an image of themselves that is impressive and unshakable because somewhere underneath that image, they are not entirely sure they are enough on their own. Brian fits this pattern very closely. The intellectual confidence, the cultural sophistication, the slightly superior way he carries himself through the world. All of it is real in the sense that Brian genuinely feels it and genuinely believes it. And all of it is also a way of keeping the deeper insecurity at bay. A way of making sure that the world sees a version of Brian that feels strong and worthy, even when the Brian underneath is not always so sure. A psychologist would also note that Brian's self-image is not constant. It fluctuates. There are moments where Brian feels genuinely good about himself, where his confidence is real and grounded and earned. And there are other moments where that confidence cracks, where something happens that pulls Brian back into the quieter, more uncertain place where he is not sure he is measuring up. The show moves Brian between these two states throughout the series, and that movement is one of the things that makes Brian feel like a real and layered character, rather than a flat one. He is not always confident. He is not always doubtful. He is somewhere in between, and the balance shifts depending on what is happening in his life and how the world around him is responding to him at any given time. Understanding the way Brian's ego and his self-doubt interact with each other opens up a conversation about some of the specific ways those internal tensions show up in his behavior toward other people, particularly when it comes to the way Brian holds himself to a different standard than the one he applies to the rest of the world. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. The gap between the moral and intellectual standards Brian sets for himself and the way he actually behaves in practice reveals a fascinating and recurring layer of contradiction that runs through nearly everything he does. Section 6. Hypocrisy and Moral Contradictions. Brian Griffin is, in many ways, the most politically and morally opinionated character in Family Guy. He has strong views about what is right and wrong. He cares about social issues. He thinks about ethics and fairness and the way the world should work. He often positions himself as the most morally aware person in the Griffin household, and in a lot of early episodes, that positioning feels earned. Brian is the one who notices when something is unfair. He is the one who speaks up when something does not sit right with him. He is the one who has thought about these things more carefully than anyone else in the room, and he is not shy about sharing what he thinks. You can hear it in the way Brian talks during family conversations. He brings a seriousness to discussions about the world that the other members of the Griffin household do not always bring. He cares. He is engaged. And for a while, that moral awareness feels like one of the most appealing things about Brian as a character. It makes him feel like someone worth listening to. Someone whose opinions come from a place of genuine thought and genuine care about the world around him. But as the series progresses and Brian's character becomes more complex, a different pattern starts to emerge alongside all of that moral awareness. Brian does not always live up to the standards he sets for himself. The gap between what Brian says he believes and the way Brian actually behaves in his day-to-day life is one of the most consistent and revealing things about him across the entire series. And a psychologist looking at that gap would find a great deal worth examining, because the contradictions Brian lives with are not small or occasional. They are a fundamental part of how he moves through the world, and they show up again and again in ways that the show does not shy away from. One of the most well-known examples of this contradiction involves Brian's relationship with guns. Brian has, at various points in the series, expressed views that are critical of gun ownership. He has positioned himself as someone who understands the dangers of firearms and who believes that access to guns is a serious problem that society needs to address. He has spoken about it in a way that suggests he has thought carefully about the issue and arrived at a considered position. And yet, Brian has also been shown to own a gun himself. The contradiction is right there, in plain sight, and the show does not shy away from it or try to explain it away. It lets the audience see both sides of the situation, Brian's stated beliefs and Brian's actual behavior, and it allows the tension between those two things to exist without offering a neat resolution. A psychologist would find this kind of contradiction very interesting to examine, because it reveals something important about the relationship between what a person believes and what a person actually does in practice. For most people, there is some gap between their ideals and their behavior. No one lives perfectly according to their principles every single day. Life is complicated, and sometimes the things we say we value and the choices we actually make do not line up perfectly. But the size of the gap matters, and in Brian's case, the gap can sometimes feel quite large. Brian is not just slightly inconsistent. He is sometimes dramatically at odds with the version of himself that he presents to the world. And the show returns to that dynamic again and again across many seasons because it is one of the most honest things about who Brian actually is. The way Brian's hypocrisy plays out in his interactions with the other characters in the show is particularly revealing. Brian does not just hold his liberal, progressive values quietly and let other people draw their own conclusions about where he stands. He preaches them. He talks about them. He makes sure that the people around him know where he stands on issues and what he thinks about the way the world should work. He brings his opinions into conversations uninvited sometimes, and he delivers them with a kind of moral weight that suggests he is not just sharing a thought, but making a statement about how things ought to be. And that preaching quality, that tendency to lecture or to position himself as morally superior, is what makes the contradictions land so hard when they do come to the surface. If Brian were quiet about his values, the gap between his beliefs and his behavior might be less noticeable. Because Brian is so vocal about what he thinks is right and wrong, every time his actual behavior falls short of those standards, It becomes something that the people around him can see and comment on and use against him.
Glenn Quagmire is one of the characters in the show who most directly confronts Brian about these contradictions.
Quagmire and Brian have an antagonistic relationship that runs through many episodes of the series, and a significant part of that antagonism comes from Quagmire's willingness to look at Brian honestly and say the things that most other characters in the show do not say. The dynamic between Quagmire and Brian is not just two characters who do not get along. It is something more specific than that. Quagmire sees through Brian in a way that Brian does not always see through himself. Quagmire notices the contradictions. He notices the way Brian positions himself as morally superior while failing to live up to his own standards, and he is not afraid to point that out, directly and bluntly, in a way that forces the audience to see it too. At one point in the series, Quagmire delivers a speech directly to Brian in which he lays out, in unflinching terms, the ways in which Brian falls short of the image he has built for himself. Quagmire points out Brian's selfishness. He points out Brian's self-righteousness. He points out the way Brian preaches values that he does not actually follow in his own life. He makes the case, calmly and thoroughly, that the Brian everyone sees on the surface and the Brian who actually exists underneath are two very different people. It is a significant moment in the series because it is one of the few times that someone in Brian's world holds up a mirror and forces him to look at the person he actually is, rather than the person he has spent so much time and effort convincing everyone else he is. What makes the Quagmire confrontations psychologically interesting is the way Brian responds to them. Brian does not immediately accept what Quagmire is saying. He does not sit down and reflect on the truth in those words and come out the other side as a changed and more self-aware person. The show does not work that way, and Brian's character does not work that way either. Instead, Brian tends to push back. He tends to defend himself. He tends to hold on to the image he has built even when the evidence is right in front of him. And that response tells you something important about how deeply Brian is invested in the version of himself that he presents to the world. Letting go of that version would mean letting go of something that Brian has built over a very long time. And that is not something that happens easily or quickly, even when someone is pointing out the cracks in it. The fact that other characters beyond Quagmire also notice Brian's contradictions adds another layer to the dynamic. It is not just one person who sees the gap between who Brian says he is and who Brian actually is. Other people in Brian's life have noticed it too, in smaller ways and at different moments. And every time someone points it out, or every time Brian's behavior contradicts his stated beliefs in a way that someone else can see, it sends a small signal back to Brian about how the world perceives him. Those signals do not always change Brian's behavior in the moment, but they accumulate over time, and they contribute to the larger sense of tension that runs through Brian's character. The tension between the self he wants to be and the self he actually is. The hypocrisy that runs through Brian's character is not something that Brian is consciously aware of in the way that Quagmire or the audience might be. This is an important distinction. Brian does not walk around thinking to himself that he is being hypocritical. He genuinely believes the things he says he believes. He genuinely thinks of himself as someone who is morally thoughtful and socially aware. The gap between those beliefs and his behavior is something that exists, but it is not something Brian is always able to see clearly from the inside. A psychologist would describe this as a kind of blind spot, a place where Brian's self-awareness, which is genuinely strong in other areas of his life, simply does not reach. And blind spots like this are actually very common. Most people have areas of their own behavior that they are not fully honest with themselves about. Places where the self-image they have built is too important to challenge, even when the evidence is sitting right in front of them. The way Brian's moral contradictions affect his relationships with the people around him is worth looking at closely. When Brian preaches his values and then fails to live up to them, the people who notice that gap tend to lose some of their trust in him over time. They start to see Brian not as the wise, grounded presence he wants to be, but as someone who says one thing and does another. And that shift in how other people see him affects the way Brian feels about himself, even if he does not always admit it or acknowledge it out loud. The social feedback that Brian receives when his contradictions are pointed out contributes to the larger pattern of insecurity and self-doubt that has been running through his character from the very beginning of this video. There is also a larger psychological pattern worth noting here. Brian's hypocrisy is not just about individual contradictions, like the gun ownership issue.
It is part of a broader dynamic in which Brian has constructed an idealized version of himself, a version that is morally superior, intellectually gifted, and emotionally mature. And that version does not always match the person he actually is in practice.
The ideals are real. Brian does care about those things. But the gap between caring about something and actually living by it every single day is something that Brian has not fully closed. And the show keeps returning to that gap because it is one of the most honest and interesting things about him as a player. Character: a psychologist would likely observe that Brian's moral contradictions are connected to the same root dynamics that have been present throughout this entire video. The insecurity, the need to be seen a certain way, the difficulty of being fully honest with himself about who he is and how he behaves. These are not separate issues. They are all part of the same larger picture, and they all influence each other in ways that shape Brian's experience of the world and the way he relates to the people in it. Understanding Brian's hypocrisy is not about judging him for it. It is about seeing how it fits into everything else that makes Brian the character he is, and how all of these pieces connect to each other in ways that make him one of the most layered characters in animated television.
Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown.
The contradictions and the insecurity that live inside Brian become even more visible when you start looking at the one relationship in his life that has meant more to him than almost any other. Section 7. Brian and Stewie, Friendship Dynamics. If there is one relationship in Family Guy that reveals more about Brian Griffin than any other, it is the relationship between Brian and Stewie. This is not the relationship that most people would point to first when they think about Brian. Most people would think about Brian and Peter, or Brian and the Griffin family as a whole. But the bond between Brian and Stewie is quietly one of the deepest and most emotionally complex relationships in the entire series. And if you spend time watching how it develops and changes across the show, it tells you an enormous amount about who Brian is on the inside, the parts of Brian that he does not always show to the rest of the world. It is a relationship that, on the surface, might seem like an unlikely one, and yet, over the course of many seasons, it becomes one of the most important connections either of them has. The relationship between Brian and Stewie did not start as a friendship. In the very early seasons of Family Guy, Stewie Griffin is portrayed as something close to a villain. He is a baby with an obsession with world domination. He is dangerous. He is unpredictable. He speaks in a way that suggests he is far older and far more calculating than his small size would imply. Stewie is not warm in those early episodes. He is cold and sharp and focused on his own goals in a way that makes him feel like a very different kind of character from the rest of the Griffin household. And Brian in those early episodes does not have a warm or easy relationship with Stewie at all. There is tension between them, there is friction. The two of them are very different kinds of beings occupying the same space, and neither one of them is particularly comfortable with the other. Brian does not always know what to make of Stewie in those early seasons. Stewie is unpredictable in a way that makes Brian uneasy, and Stewie does not always treat Brian with any particular warmth or respect. He can be dismissive, he can be cutting. He looks at Brian the way someone might look at an obstacle or an annoyance, rather than a friend. The two of them exist in the same household and they interact, but the idea that they would one day become genuinely close friends feels very far away from where they start. There is a distance between them that feels deliberate, and it takes a long time for that distance to begin closing. That evolution from antagonism to deep and genuine friendship is one of the most significant character developments in the entire run of the show. It does not happen all at once. It happens slowly, over the course of many episodes and many seasons, in small moments that accumulate over time. A shared experience here, a moment of unexpected vulnerability there, a scene where one of them does something for the other that reveals a level of care that was not there before. The friendship builds gradually, and because it builds gradually, it feels earned. It feels real. It does not feel like something the writers just decided to put in place one day. It feels like something that grew naturally out of who these two characters are and what they need from each other. And that natural growth is one of the things that makes the bond between them so compelling to watch. Throughout the series, Brian and Stewie also go on adventures together. They travel, they get into trouble.
They work through problems side by side in situations that take them far outside of the Griffin household and into all kinds of unexpected places. These shared experiences matter a great deal for the bond between them. When two people go through difficult or unusual situations together, it creates a kind of connection that ordinary, day-to-day interactions cannot replicate. Brian and Stewie have been through things together that no one else in the family has shared with either of them, and those shared experiences become a foundation that their friendship is built on top of. One of the episodes that most directly explores the depth of the Brian and Stewie bond is Brian and Stewie, which is in Season 9. In this episode, Brian and Stewie end up locked inside a library overnight. They are stuck together in a confined space with no one else around, and they have to figure out how to get through the night together. The library itself creates an interesting atmosphere for the episode. It is quiet. It is still. It is a place where the usual noise and chaos of the Griffin household cannot reach them. And that stillness gives the episode room to breathe in a way that most Family Guy episodes do not. What makes this episode stand out is the way it strips away all of the usual distractions and noise and just lets Brian and Stewie be in a space together. There is no Peter to react to. There is no family chaos to navigate or respond to.
It is just the two of them, and the episode uses that simplicity to go deeper into their dynamic than most episodes do. Being confined together forces a kind of honesty that might not come out in a normal setting. When you have nowhere to go and no one else to turn to, you end up having to deal with the person right in front of you. And that dealing can bring out things that would otherwise stay hidden. During the time they spend together in the library, Brian and Stewie talk. They argue. They push each other in ways that feel real and unguarded. And they also, in quieter moments, reveal things about themselves that they do not always reveal to the people they see every day. There is a vulnerability in the episode that feels different from the usual tone of the show. It feels like the writers were genuinely interested in what these two characters mean to each other, and they used the confined setting to explore that in a way that felt honest and unhurried. The episode is widely regarded as one of the best character-driven episodes in the series, and the reason for that is the emotional depth it gives to the Brian and Stewie relationship. A psychologist observing the dynamic between Brian and Stewie would likely notice several things about the way their friendship functions. The first is that it is a relationship built on mutual need. Brian needs Stewie in his life in a way that he might not fully acknowledge out loud. Stewie, for all of his intelligence and capability, also needs Brian. They fill roles in each other's lives that no one else in the Griffin household fills, and that mutual dependence is one of the things that makes their bond feel so strong and so lasting. For Brian specifically, the friendship with Stewie offers something that his other relationships in the show do not always provide. Stewie sees Brian clearly. He is not impressed by Brian's intellectual posturing or his cultured self-image in the way that some of the other characters might be. Stewie is smart enough to see through all of that and to engage with Brian as he actually is, rather than as the version of himself that Brian works so hard to present. And in a way that might feel uncomfortable at first, that honesty is actually comforting to Brian. It means that the friendship with Stewie is one of the few places in Brian's life where he does not have to perform, or pretend, or maintain an image. He can just be himself, without the weight of trying to be someone slightly better or slightly more impressive than who he actually is. That kind of space is rare for Brian, and he values it, even if he does not always say so. For Stewie, Brian serves as something of an anchor. Stewie is a complicated character with his own set of emotional struggles and his own complicated relationship with the world. Having Brian around gives Stewie a stable presence, someone who is always there, someone who cares about him in a consistent and reliable way. Stewie has moments of his own vulnerability across the series, moments where the tough and calculating exterior cracks, and something softer and more uncertain shows through. And in those moments, Brian is often the one who is there, not with grand gestures or dramatic responses, but simply by being present and by being someone Stewie can trust. That consistency matters enormously to Stewie, and Brian provides it without always having to try. The way Brian and Stewie interact in their day-to-day life on the show also reveals a lot about the texture of their bond. They bicker, they tease each other, they sometimes get on each other's nerves in ways that are funny to watch, but underneath all of that, there is a warmth and a loyalty that comes through even in the moments when they are at odds with each other. Brian will do things for Stewie that he would not do for most other people. Stewie will say things to Brian that suggest he genuinely cares about Brian's well-being, even when he phrases them in a way that is sharp or sarcastic. The affection between them is real,
even when it is not always expressed in an obviously affectionate way. A psychologist would also likely note that the Brian and Stewie friendship is one of the places in the show where Brian's emotional life becomes most visible. Brian is guarded with most of the people around him. He keeps his feelings close to the chest. He does not open up easily or often. But with Stewie, Brian is a little more open, a little more honest, a little more willing to let the other person see what is actually going on inside him. This does not mean that Brian is fully transparent with Stewie at all times. He is not. But compared to the way Brian relates to Peter or to Lois or to the rest of the world, the friendship with Stewie allows for a greater degree of emotional honesty. And that is significant for someone who spends so much of his life keeping the world at a slight distance. The evolution of the Brian and Stewie bond also mirrors something larger that happens to both characters over the course of the series. Both of them change. Both of them become more complex, more emotionally layered, more human in the way they experience the world. And their friendship is both a cause and a reflection of that change. They help each other grow, even when neither of them would necessarily use that language to describe what is happening. The bond between them is not just a friendship in the simple sense of the word. It is a relationship that has shaped both of them, and that continues to shape them as the series moves forward. What a psychologist would ultimately observe about the Brian and Stewie relationship is that it represents one of the most emotionally honest connections in Brian's life. In a world where Brian often feels like he does not fully belong, where he is always navigating the tension between who he is and how the world sees him, the friendship with Stewie is one of the places where that tension eases, even if only a little. It is a place where Brian can be seen, and where being seen does not feel threatening. And that matters enormously for someone who has spent so much of his life feeling like full connection is just slightly out of reach. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. The emotional security that Brian finds in his friendship with Stewie stands in sharp contrast to the way Brian carries himself within the larger Griffin household, where a very different kind of pressure has been quietly building inside him for a long time. Section 8. Brian as the Griffin family's voice of reason. From the very beginning of Family Guy, Brian Griffin occupies a specific role in the Griffin household. He is the calm one. He is the one who stays grounded when everything around him is falling apart. He is the one who looks at a situation and tries to figure out what the reasonable, sensible response would be, and then tries to steer the family in that direction. This role is established early, and it becomes one of the defining things about Brian in the eyes of the audience. When you think about Brian Griffin in the context of the Griffin family, one of the first things that comes to mind is that he is the voice of reason. He is the one who is supposed to have his head on straight. And in the early seasons of the show, that impression holds up very well. Brian is steady, Brian is reliable. Brian is the one character in the household who seems to understand that not every problem needs to be solved by doing something reckless or impulsive. Peter Griffin is, in almost every way, the opposite of that. Peter is impulsive. Peter acts before he thinks. Peter makes decisions based on what feels good in the moment rather than what is going to work out well in the long run. He does reckless things, sometimes dangerous things, and he does them with a cheerfulness and a lack of awareness that can be genuinely staggering to watch. Peter will stumble into a situation, make it dramatically worse without realizing it, and then move on to the next thing as though nothing happened. The consequences of his actions tend to fall on the people around him, and the Griffin household is constantly reacting to the fallout of whatever Peter has just done. Brian is frequently right there in the middle of it all, trying to point out why what Peter is doing is a bad idea. You can see it in the way Brian holds himself during these moments. He is standing nearby, watching what is about to unfold, and there is a quality to his expression and his posture that suggests he has already seen this coming and already knows how it is going to end. He will say something. He will try to slow things down. He will try to inject some logic and some common sense into a household that does not always have a lot of either. And sometimes Peter listens, at least a little. And other times, Peter has already moved forward before Brian has even finished his sentence. In the early seasons, this dynamic works well for Brian in a lot of ways. It gives him a clear purpose within the family. It gives him a reason to be in the room and a reason for the audience to pay attention to him. He is the one who makes sense. He is the one who sees the situation clearly when no one else does. And that role feels good.
at least on the surface. It feels like Brian is valued. It feels like Brian is contributing something important to the family dynamic. He is not just a dog who lives in the house and goes along for the ride. He is a dog who keeps the house from descending into complete chaos, and that is a significant thing. For Brian, who has spent so much of his life trying to find a place where he feels important and needed, the voice of reason role provides exactly that. It gives him a sense of purpose that feels meaningful and real. Lois Griffin is also worth considering in the context of this dynamic. Lois is often in a position similar to Brian's in the household. She is also trying to be the reasonable one, the one who keeps things from going too far off the rails. And in some ways, Brian and Lois occupy a similar space within the family. They are both trying to be the stabilizing force. But Lois has a different kind of authority than Brian does. She is Peter's wife. She is the mother of the household. Brian is the dog. And that difference matters because it affects the way the rest of the family responds when Brian tries to offer his perspective. Lois can push back on Peter in ways that Brian sometimes cannot, and that dynamic can make Brian feel even more like his voice is not always being heard in the way he needs it to be. A psychologist would likely observe, however, that the role of the voice of reason in a family like the Griffin family comes with a set of psychological costs that are worth examining closely. Being the responsible one, the calm one, the one who is always trying to keep things together, is a role that takes a toll on a person over time. It requires a constant level of vigilance and effort that the other members of the family do not have to put in. Brian has to be paying attention all the time. He has to be reading the room, assessing the situation, figuring out what Peter is about to do wrong and how to prevent it, or at least minimize the damage. That is a lot of mental and emotional energy to expend on a regular basis, and it does not always get acknowledged or appreciated by the people around him in the way Brian might hope it would. The way this role affects Brian's stress levels is something that shows up in his behavior across the series, even if it is not always the focus of a particular episode. Brian can be seen, in various moments, looking tired or frustrated or worn down by the chaos that surrounds him. These are not big dramatic moments. They are small ones. A sigh, a look of exhaustion after Peter has done something particularly reckless. A moment where Brian tries to say something reasonable and no one in the room is listening. And the way Brian's expression shifts in that moment tells you something about how he is feeling underneath the composed exterior he maintains. The stress does not disappear just because Brian keeps his composure on the outside. It accumulates. It builds up quietly over time, and it affects the way Brian experiences his life in the Griffin household on a day-to-day basis. One of the things a psychologist would pay close attention to is the way Brian's role as the voice of reason interacts with his need to feel valued and respected. Brian is not just trying to be the reasonable one because he genuinely cares about preventing chaos in the household, although that care is real. He is also doing it, at least in part, because it makes him feel important. It gives him a place in the family that matters. It makes him feel like he is needed, like the household would be in worse shape without him in it. And for someone like Brian, who already struggles with feelings of inadequacy and a sense of not fully belonging, that feeling of being needed is something he holds on to tightly. It is one of the things that makes Brian feel like he has a reason to be there, a reason to take up space in the Griffin home. The problem is that being the voice of reason does not always lead to the outcome Brian is hoping for. Peter does not always listen. The family does not always take Brian's advice. And there are episodes where Brian points out the obvious, tries to steer the family away from a bad decision, and is completely ignored. The conversation moves on without him. The family does what it was going to do anyway, and Brian is left standing there, having said his piece and having it mean nothing. When that happens, the effect on Brian is not just mild annoyance. It is something deeper. It touches on Brian's fear of being dismissed, his fear of being seen as unimportant, and his ongoing struggle with the feeling that no matter how much he contributes, the people around him do not fully register what he is doing or appreciate the work. Effort it takes. This dynamic can breed a kind of quiet resentment over time. Resentment is not something Brian shows openly or loudly. He is too proud for that. And his self-image as the calm, reasonable one does not leave a lot of room for admitting that he is angry or frustrated with the people he lives with. But it is there, underneath the surface, in the way Brian sometimes pulls back from conversations, in the way he occasionally stops trying to be helpful and just lets the chaos unfold around him without intervening. There are moments in the series where Brian's usual patience visibly wears thin,
where the weight of always being the one who is trying to hold things together starts to show in the way he carries himself. He does not explode, he does not make a scene, but something shifts in him, and the people who are paying attention can feel it. A psychologist would recognize this pattern as something very common in people who have taken on a caretaking or stabilizing role within a family or a group. When you are always the one who is trying to hold things together, and the people around you do not always acknowledge that effort or reciprocate it, a sense of being taken for granted starts to build. And that sense of being taken for granted can slowly start to erode the satisfaction that the role once provided. Brian started out feeling like his role as the voice of reason was something that mattered, something that gave him purpose and value within the household. Over time, as the role becomes more of a burden than a source of meaning, the feelings associated with it shift. The purpose starts to feel less like a gift and more like an obligation that no one asked him to carry and no one thanks him for carrying. There is also something worth examining about the way Brian's role in the family affects his relationship with his own identity. Brian has spent a lot of energy across the series trying to figure out who he is and what his place in the world is supposed to be. The voice of reason role gives him an answer to that question, at least within the context of the Griffin household. He knows who he is in relation to the family. He is the smart one. He is the calm one. He is the one who keeps things from falling apart. And as long as that role is working, as long as Brian feels like the family needs him in that capacity, his sense of identity feels relatively stable and secure. But when the role starts to feel hollow, when Brian realizes that his advice is not being taken and that the family would probably muddle through just fine without him stepping in, the stability that the role provided starts to waver. And that wavering connects back to the larger identity struggles that have been present in Brian's character from the very beginning of this video. If Brian is not the voice of reason, if that role does not actually matter as much as he once believed it did, then the question of who Brian is and what his purpose is becomes a lot more open and a lot more uncomfortable to sit with. The way Brian navigates this tension between the role he has been given and the way that role actually feels in practice is one of the quieter but more emotionally significant threads in his character across the series. It does not always make for big dramatic storylines, but it is always there, running underneath the surface, shaping the way Brian feels about himself and about the people he lives with. And it adds another layer of complexity to a character who is already carrying a great deal of emotional weight from everything else going on in his life. Understanding Brian's relationship with his role as the family's voice of reason sets the stage for looking at something even deeper in Brian's character. Something that has been present in his storylines for a long time and that speaks to the most fundamental questions Brian asks himself about his own life and what it all means. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. The stress and quiet frustration that come with always being the one who is supposed to have things figured out connect directly to a set of much larger questions that Brian has been carrying with him throughout the entire series. Section 9. Existential Themes and Identity Struggles. There is a thread that runs through Brian Griffin's character that is quieter and deeper than most of the things we have talked about so far in this video. It is not something that shows up in big, dramatic moments. It does not announce itself loudly or demand attention. It lives underneath everything else Brian does. Underneath the drinking, underneath the relationships, underneath the ego and the insecurity and the hypocrisy. It is always there, in the background, shaping the way Brian experiences his life even when no one around him seems to notice it. And if you spend time watching Brian across many episodes and many seasons, paying attention not just to what he does, but to how he feels while he is doing it, this thread becomes one of the most important things about him. It is the question that Brian keeps coming back to over and over again, even when he does not say it out loud. And that question is this: what does any of this actually mean? What is the point of all of it? What is Brian supposed to do with his life? And does his life have a meaning that is worth finding? These are big questions. They are the kinds of questions that philosophers and thinkers have been wrestling with for a very long time. And for most animated characters, these questions would never come up at all. Most animated characters exist to be funny, to react to situations, to serve the needs of the jokes and the storylines the writers create for them. They do not sit with existential uncertainty. They do not wonder whether life has a deeper purpose. They do not carry the weight of not knowing whether what they are doing with their time actually matters in any larger sense. But Brian does. Brian thinks about these things. He feels the weight of them.
And the way he carries that weight across the series is one of the most interesting and most human things about him as a character. Brian's atheism is deeply connected to the existential dimension of his character. Brian does not believe in God. He has been open about that throughout the series, and as we discussed earlier, his decision to write a book about atheism in Believe It or Not, I Believe in Season 7 brought that belief into sharp focus. But Brian's atheism is not just a political stance or a talking point that he uses to set himself apart from the people around him. It is a genuine worldview, and it carries with it a set of implications that Brian has had to sit with over the course of his life. If there is no God, then there is no grand plan. There is no predetermined purpose that has been laid out for Brian or for anyone else. Meaning is not something that comes from the outside and gets handed to you. It is something you have to find on your own, or create on your own, or live without entirely. Living as an atheist in Quahog also adds a layer of isolation to Brian's existential experience. Quahog is not a place where Brian's worldview fits in comfortably. The community around him tends to be more traditional, more religious, more connected to a shared set of beliefs that Brian does not share. That means Brian is not just carrying big questions about meaning and purpose on his own. He is carrying them in an environment where most of the people around him have already answered those questions in a way that does not apply to him. They have faith, they have a framework. Brian does not, and that makes the questions feel lonelier and heavier than they might in a different kind of place. For a lot of people, the idea that life does not have a built-in meaning is liberating. It means freedom. It means you get to decide for yourself what matters and what does not. But for Brian, it also carries a weight that does not always feel freeing. It feels, at times, like an open-ended question that never quite gets answered. If there is no built-in meaning to life, then Brian has to make meaning for himself. And the ways Brian has tried to do that, the writing, the intellectual pursuits, the relationships, the role he plays in the Griffin family, the moral positions he holds, have not always given him the sense of purpose and fulfillment he was hoping they would. Each of these things is, in its own way, an attempt to build meaning out of the raw material of Brian's life. And each of them has given Brian something, but none of them have given him everything he was looking for. Brian's writing is one of the clearest examples of how this existential search plays out in his behavior. When Brian writes, he is not just trying to create something entertaining, or something that will get him recognition, although those things matter to him too. He is trying to say something. He is trying to put something meaningful into the world, something that reflects the way he sees life and the way he understands the experience of being alive. There is a hopefulness to the way Brian approaches a new writing project. It feels in those early moments like this could be the thing that finally gives his life the sense of direction and purpose he has been looking for. Writing feels like it could be the answer to the question of what Brian is supposed to be doing with his time. It feels like the thing that could make everything else feel worth it. And yet, the writing does not always work out. The books do not always get published. The audience does not always respond the way Brian hoped they would. And when that happens, it does not just feel like a creative setback. It feels like the search for meaning has hit another dead end. Brian pours himself into something that feels important, and the world does not always confirm that importance back to him. That experience repeats itself across the series, and each time it happens, it adds a little more to the restlessness that Brian carries with him. That restlessness is worth paying attention to, because it is one of the most consistent and persistent things about Brian's character. Brian does not seem fully at peace with his life. He does not seem like someone who has figured out what he is supposed to be doing and is content with the answer. There is always something slightly unsettled about the way Brian moves through the world. A sense that something is missing. A sense that life should feel more meaningful than it currently does. You can see it in the way Brian sits in a room sometimes, not engaged in anything specific, just present. And there is a quality to his stillness that suggests he is thinking about something larger than whatever is happening in front of him. It is not dramatic, it is not loud, it is just there quietly underneath everything else. A psychologist would likely observe that Brian's restlessness is connected to the way he processes the absence of clear meaning in his life. Some people are comfortable sitting with uncertainty. They can live with the idea that life does not have a single, obvious purpose, and they can find peace in that ambiguity. Brian is not one of those people, or at least he does not appear to be. Brian seems to need a sense of direction,
A sense that what he is doing matters, and that his life is adding up to something. And when that sense is not there, when the meaning he is looking for stays just out of reach, Brian feels it as a kind of quiet, ongoing dissatisfaction that colors the way he experiences everything else. The way this existential dimension of Brian's character interacts with the rest of his emotional life is worth examining closely. The drinking that we talked about earlier in the video can be seen, in part, through this lens.
Brian reaching for a martini is not just a way of coping with frustration or disappointment in the moment.
It is also a way of quieting the larger, more uncomfortable feeling underneath. The feeling that life might not have the meaning Brian wants it to have.
The ritual of the martini also gives Brian a small, reliable pocket of control in a world that otherwise feels uncertain and shapeless. It is something Brian can do that feels consistent, that feels the same every time, and that creates a brief sense of order in the middle of everything else. Brian's relationships also carry the weight of this existential search. When Brian looks for connection with other people, when he pursues romantic relationships or invests himself in his friendship with Stewie, part of what he is looking for is a sense that his life matters to someone else, that he is not alone in the world, that the time he spends here is being shared with people who value him and who he values in return. Connection is one of the ways Brian tries to make meaning out of his life, and when connection falls short or does not last, the existential dissatisfaction underneath grows a little stronger. There is also a loneliness to the existential dimension of Brian's character that sets it apart from the other things we have discussed. The questions Brian is asking himself about life and meaning are not questions that the rest of the Griffin family is asking. Peter is not lying awake at night wondering whether life has a purpose. Lois is not wrestling with the idea that meaning might not be inherent in the world. Even Stewie, for all of his complexity, approaches the world from a different angle than Brian does. Brian is, in many ways, alone with these thoughts. He carries them by himself, and there is no one in his immediate world who fully understands the weight of what he is carrying, or what it feels like to live with that kind of uncertainty every single day. A psychologist might also note that Brian's existential struggles are not something that resolve neatly over the course of the series. They do not get tied up in a bow. Brian does not arrive at a clear answer to the questions he has been asking. He continues to search. He continues to feel the restlessness. He continues to wonder whether there is more to life than what he has found so far. And that ongoing quality, that sense that the search is never truly finished, is one of the things that makes Brian feel like a genuinely complex and deeply human character, even though he is, of course, a dog. The existential questions Brian carries with him also connect back to the identity struggles that have been present throughout this entire video. Brian has spent so much of his life trying to figure out who he is and what his place in the world is supposed to be. The existential dimension of his character adds another layer to that struggle. It is not just that Brian does not know where he fits. It is that Brian is not entirely sure the world has a shape that would allow him to fit neatly into it in the first place. And living with that uncertainty, day after day, episode after episode, is one of the heaviest things Brian carries with him. Understanding the existential weight that Brian carries with him opens up a conversation about something that might seem, on the surface, like it is a very different topic entirely. And yet, in practice, it connects back to everything we have been discussing in a way that feels surprisingly natural. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. The deep questions Brian asks himself about meaning and identity do not disappear when he goes about his daily life, and they surface in some of the most unexpected and revealing ways through the very nature of what Brian actually is. Section 10. Human Traits versus Animal Instincts. There is something about Brian Griffin that the show returns to again and again, sometimes for laughs, and sometimes for something quieter and more interesting than a joke. Brian is a dog. We have talked about that fact throughout this entire video, and we have explored what it means for his identity and his sense of belonging in the world. But there is a specific dimension of Brian being a dog that deserves its own focused attention. And that is the way his animal instincts occasionally break through the sophisticated, intellectual exterior he has spent so much time building. Brian does not just think like a human. He also, sometimes, acts like a dog. And the tension between those two things, between the higher level thinking and the instincts that live underneath it, is one of the most fascinating and most telling aspects of his character. The show has been playing with this duality from the very beginning.
From the moment Brian was introduced, there has been a deliberate contrast built into the way he is written and the way he moves through the world. Brian walks on two legs. He talks, he reads, he drinks martinis and has opinions about politics and literature. He sits at the dinner table with the rest of the Griffin family and participates in conversations like any other member of the household. Everything about the way Brian presents himself suggests that he is, for all practical purposes, a person. And then, without warning, something triggers an instinct that has nothing to do with any of that. Something moves quickly across the room, and Brian's attention snaps to it in a way that feels automatic. Something loud and mechanical turns on nearby, and Brian reacts with a jolt of fear or anxiety that bypasses his rational mind entirely. A smell catches him off guard and pulls him somewhere he did not intend to go. These moments arrive without buildup, and they pass quickly, and because of that, they can be easy to overlook if you are not paying close attention. But they are consistent, they are recurring, and they tell you something very important about the layers that make up who Brian Griffin actually is. One of the most well-known examples of this is Brian's relationship with the vacuum cleaner. Brian has been shown across multiple episodes and across many seasons reacting to vacuum cleaners with a visible anxiety or discomfort that he cannot fully suppress. The vacuum is loud, it moves around the house in an unpredictable way. It makes a sound that, for Brian, seems to trigger something deep and instinctive. When the vacuum comes on, Brian's composure shifts. His body reacts before his mind has a chance to intervene. He might move away from it. He might tense up. He might try to act like it does not bother him, but the discomfort is visible, regardless of how hard he tries to cover it. And what makes these moments interesting is that they happen every time. The vacuum cleaner does not become less threatening to Brian the more he encounters it. The instinct does not fade or soften with repeated exposure. It stays there, reliable and consistent. A small reminder that underneath all of Brian's sophistication, something older and more primal is still very much present. The texture of these moments is worth slowing down on for a moment. When Brian encounters the vacuum, there is usually a beat where his usual composure falters. The cultured, put-together version of Brian that has been present for the rest of the scene suddenly gives way to something rawer and less controlled. And then, just as quickly, Brian pulls himself back together. He straightens up. He returns to whatever he was doing or saying. The moment passes. But it was there, and the people in the room saw it. And Brian knows they saw it. There is a small cost to that, a small dent in the image Brian works so hard to maintain. And that cost accumulates quietly over time. A psychologist observing this pattern would likely find it very interesting to think about, because it reveals something important about the relationship between the two layers of Brian's character. Brian has built an entire identity on top of his intelligence and his sophistication, his cultured way of engaging with the world, his intellectual curiosity, his carefully constructed self-image. All of it is real, and all of it is something Brian has invested a great deal of effort into becoming. But underneath all of that, there are instincts that operate on a completely different level. Instincts that do not care about Brian's self-image or his carefully constructed identity. Instincts that are older and deeper and more fundamental than anything Brian has built on top of them. They were there before Brian learned to read. They were there before Brian learned to hold a conversation. They are part of what Brian is at his most basic level, and no amount of intellectual development can fully override them. The chasing behavior is another example of this dynamic playing out in Brian's life. Brian has been shown at various points in this series reacting to sudden movement in a way that is more dog than intellectual. Something darts past him, and there is a moment, brief as it is, where the instinct to give chase takes hold, before the rational part of Brian's mind has a chance to catch up and stop it. The speed of the instinct is part of what makes it so revealing. It does not go through Brian's thinking mind first. It does not get filtered through his self-awareness or his sense of how a cultured, sophisticated dog is supposed to behave in public. It just happens. And then Brian catches himself, and the moment is over, and he moves on. But for that fraction of a second, the dog underneath was completely in charge. Beyond the vacuum cleaner and the chasing, there are other, smaller, recurring moments throughout the series where Brian's animal nature surfaces in quieter ways. Brian will sometimes sniff at something without seeming to fully realize he is doing it. He will react to certain sounds with a heightened alertness that goes beyond what a normal reaction would be. These moments are often smaller and less obvious than the vacuum cleaner scenes, but they serve the same purpose. They are gentle, consistent reminders that Brian is not entirely what he appears to be on the outside. There is another version of Brian underneath, one that operates on instinct and sensation rather than thought and reason. And that version is always present, always ready to surface when something triggers it. A psychologist might interpret this duality in a number of ways. One way to look at it is as a kind of symbolic tension between what a person wants to be and what they actually are at their most fundamental level. Brian wants to be human. He wants to exist entirely in the world of the mind, the world of ideas and conversation and culture. He has worked very hard to build a life that looks and feels like it belongs in that world. But his body and his instincts remind him regularly and reliably that he is not entirely in that world. He is also in the world of the animal, the world of instinct and sensation and reaction. And those two worlds do not always coexist comfortably inside him. This tension also connects back to something we explored very early in this video, in the first section, when we talked about Brian's contradictory identity. Brian has always been caught between two worlds. Too human to be comfortable as a simple pet, and too much of a dog to be fully accepted in the human world. The moments where Brian's animal instincts surface are small, concrete, lived-in examples of that larger dynamic playing out in real time. They are the moments where the gap between who Brian wants to be and what Brian actually is becomes visible. Not in a dramatic or painful way, but in a quiet, almost gentle way that adds texture and honesty to his character. There is also something worth examining about how Brian responds to these moments internally. When Brian's instincts take over, even briefly, there is sometimes a quality to the way he reacts afterward that suggests a small amount of embarrassment or discomfort. He does not always make a big deal out of it. He does not always draw attention to what just happened. But there is an awareness there, a quiet acknowledgement that what just happened does not quite fit with the version of himself he has been presenting to the world. And that small moment of awareness connects back to the identity tension that has been running through Brian's character from the very beginning of this video. Brian knows, on some level, that the cultured exterior and the instincts underneath are both part of him. And the moments where the instincts win, even briefly, are the moments where that knowledge becomes impossible to ignore. The show uses these moments of instinct breaking through in a way that is actually quite thoughtful, even when they are being played for laughs. They serve as regular, gentle reminders that Brian is not what he appears to be on the surface. Or rather, that Brian is not only what he appears to be on the surface. He is also something else, something older and more primal. And that something else is always there, just underneath, waiting to surface when the right conditions present themselves. A psychologist would also likely note that the coexistence of sophistication and instinct in Brian's character is not necessarily a problem that needs to be solved. It is simply a reflection of the complexity of who Brian is. Brian contains multitudes. He is intelligent and cultured and thoughtful, and he is also a dog with instincts that predate any of those things by a very long margin. Both of those things are true at the same time, and they do not cancel each other out. They exist together, side by side, and the way they interact with each other is part of what makes Brian such an interesting and layered character to observe across so many seasons of the show. The duality also adds a layer of humility to Brian's character that his ego and his intellectual self-image do not always provide on their own. No matter how cultured Brian becomes, no matter how many books he reads or how many sophisticated opinions he holds, the vacuum cleaner can still make him flinch. The movement of something across the room can still pull his attention in a way that has nothing to do with rational thought. And those moments keep Brian grounded in a way that serves his character well, even when they are uncomfortable for him in the moment. They prevent the ego from becoming completely untethered from reality, and they remind both Brian and the audience that there is always more to a person than the image they present to the world. What the human traits versus animal instincts dynamic ultimately reveals about Brian is that his character is built on a foundation of genuine complexity. He is not simply one thing or another. He is both things at once, and the tension between them is not something that gets resolved or that fades over time. It is a permanent feature of who Brian is, and it influences the way he moves through the world in ways both large and small. Understanding that duality is essential to understanding Brian as a whole, and it sets the stage for looking at how Brian's various internal tensions show up when he steps outside of the Griffin household and interacts with the wider world around him. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. The way Brian's internal contradictions and identity struggles play out becomes even more visible and even more telling when you start looking at how he behaves around people who are not part of his immediate family.
Section 11. Community and social behavior. Everything we have talked about so far in this video has mostly taken place inside the Griffin household. We have looked at Brian's relationships with the people he lives with, his role in the family, the way he carries himself in his day-to-day life at home. But Brian does not only exist inside that house. He also exists in the wider world of Quahog, and the way Brian behaves when he steps outside of the Griffin household and interacts with the people and the community around him reveals a set of patterns that are worth examining on their own. Looking at Brian in the context of the Griffin family gives you one picture of who he is. Looking at Brian in the context of Quahog, in social situations with people who are not his family, gives you a different one. And the two pictures together, the way they sit next to each other and sometimes contradict each other, add a dimension to Brian's character that we have not fully explored until now. Because when Brian is out in the world, away from the relative safety and familiarity of his family, some of the dynamics that have been building throughout this video become much more visible and much more revealing. Brian cares deeply about how other people perceive him. This is something that has been present underneath many of the things we have discussed throughout this video. In the way Brian drinks, in the way he writes, in the way he holds his moral and intellectual opinions. But it becomes especially clear when you look at the way Brian interacts with people outside of his family. When Brian is in a social situation, there is a quality to the way he carries himself that suggests he is always at least partially aware of the impression he is making. He is thinking about how he comes across. He is thinking about whether the people in the room see him the way he wants to be seen. He is invested on some level in the social image he is projecting, and that investment shapes the way he behaves in ways that are sometimes subtle and sometimes quite obvious. This means that Brian can sometimes behave differently in social situations than he does at home. At home, Brian is more relaxed in some ways. He is surrounded by people he knows, in a space he is familiar with, and even though there is chaos and frustration and all of the other things we have talked about, the Griffin household is still his base. It is the place he returns to. Out in the world, Brian is a little more on guard, a little more concerned with presentation, a little more focused on making sure the people around him understand who he is and what he thinks and what kind of person or what kind of dog he is trying to be. You can see it in the way Brian speaks in social settings, the way he chooses his words a little more carefully, the way he positions himself in conversations. There is a performance quality to the way Brian moves through the social world of Quahog. And it is a performance that Brian is putting on for an audience he genuinely cares about impressing. One of the most significant examples of how Brian's social world outside the family affects him involves the storyline around his atheism book in Believe It or Not, I Believe, in Season 7. In that episode, Brian writes a book laying out his atheist beliefs, and the reaction he gets from the Quahog community is not the one he was hoping for. The people around him do not welcome the book. They do not celebrate Brian for being brave or honest or intellectually courageous. Instead, they push back. They reject Brian and what he has written. The community responds to Brian's atheism with disapproval and hostility, and that response lands very hard on Brian, not just because it is unpleasant, but because it touches something deeper in the way Brian experiences social rejection. Quahog is not a place that is particularly open to the kind of thinking Brian engages in. The community around him tends to be more traditional, more close-minded in certain ways, and when Brian puts something out into that community that challenges the way people in Quahog see the world, the reaction is not curiosity or interest. It is resistance, and for Brian, who put so much of himself into that book, who saw it as an expression of something he genuinely believed and genuinely thought was worth saying, the community's reaction feels like a personal rejection. It is not just the book that Quahog is pushing back against. It is Brian himself. The version of Brian that wrote that book, the honest, atheist, intellectually courageous version,
is being told by the social world around him that he is not welcome.
When the Quahog community pushes back against Brian, it is not just a disagreement about ideas. It is a signal from the social world that Brian does not belong. That the things Brian believes and the way Brian sees the world are not welcome in this community. And for someone who already struggles with the question of where he fits, who already carries the weight of feeling like he does not fully belong anywhere, that kind of social rejection is particularly painful. It confirms something Brian is afraid of on a deeper level, which is that the world will not accept him as he actually is. The atheism book storyline is one of the clearest examples in the series of how social feedback from the outside world affects Brian's internal experience and his sense of self. The feud between Brian and Glenn Quagmire is another major example of how Brian's social life outside the family shapes his character. We talked about Quagmire earlier in the video when we discussed Brian's hypocrisy and moral contradictions, and the way Quagmire confronts Brian about the gap between who Brian says he is and who Brian actually is. But the feud between them is worth examining here as well, because it is one of the most sustained examples of social antagonism in Brian's life, and it reveals a great deal about how Brian handles being challenged and criticized by someone in his social world over a long period of time. Quagmire does not like Brian. This is established early, and it stays consistent throughout the series. Quagmire sees Brian in a way that is unflattering, and he is willing to say so directly and repeatedly. He does not sugarcoat his opinion of Brian. He does not soften his criticism or try to spare Brian's feelings. He says what he thinks, plainly and bluntly, and what he thinks is that Brian is selfish, self-righteous, and not nearly as good a person as Brian believes he is. The feud is not equal on both sides in every moment. Quagmire is often the more vocally critical one. Brian sometimes fires back, sometimes tries to defend himself, and sometimes seems genuinely bothered by Quagmire's willingness to look at him so directly and say what he sees. What a psychologist would find interesting about Brian's experience with Quagmire is the way it functions as a kind of social mirror. Most of the people in Brian's life do not challenge him the way Quagmire does. Most of the people in Brian's life either accept Brian's self-image or do not pay close enough attention to question it. Quagmire is different. Quagmire actively and persistently presents Brian with a version of himself that Brian does not want to see. And the way Brian responds to that, the way he resists it, the way it clearly gets under his skin even when Brian is trying to act like it does not, tells you a great deal about how much Brian's sense of self depends on being seen a certain way by the people around him. If Brian did not care what Quagmire thought of him, the feud would not carry the weight it does. The fact that it does carry that weight is itself revealing. Brian's social inconsistency is another pattern that becomes visible when you look at his behavior in the wider world. Brian is not always the same person in every social situation. He can be charming when he wants to be. He can be intellectual and engaged and interesting company when the social circumstances call for it. But he can also be self-absorbed. He can be dismissive of other people's interests and opinions in a way that does not match the tolerant, open-minded image he likes to project. He can be focused on his own needs and his own perspective in ways that the people around him notice, even if Brian himself does not always register it. This inconsistency connects back to something we discussed earlier in the video when we talked about Brian's hypocrisy. The gap between how Brian presents himself and how Brian actually behaves does not only show up in the moral contradictions we examined in that section. It also shows up in the way Brian interacts with people socially, in the small moments where his behavior does not match the image he has built. And the people around Brian and Quahog are not all blind to this. Some of them notice. Some of them push back in their own ways. And the cumulative effect of that social feedback is something that shapes Brian's experience of the world outside his family over time. A psychologist would likely observe that Brian's relationship with his social world is heavily influenced by his need for external validation. Brian does not just want to be a certain way on the inside, he wants other people to see him that way too. He wants the world to confirm his self-image back to him, to reflect the version of Brian that Brian has worked so hard to build. And when the world does that, when people respond to Brian with the kind of respect and admiration that Brian feels he deserves, Brian feels good about himself. He feels validated. He feels like the image he has constructed is real and solid and worth maintaining. When the world does not do that, when people push back or reject Brian or fail to see him the way he wants to be seen,
the effect on Brian is significant.
It does not just create social friction, it creates internal friction.
It makes Brian feel less certain about himself, less sure that the version of him he has been presenting to the world is the right one, less confident that he is going to be accepted and valued in the way he needs to be. The atheism book reaction, the ongoing tension with Quagmire, the smaller moments of social friction that happen throughout the series, all of them contribute to a picture of someone whose sense of self is more dependent on social feedback than Brian
Would probably want to admit.
There is also a loneliness embedded in Brian's social experience that is worth sitting with. Brian wants connection. He wants to be part of the community around him. He wants to be respected and valued and seen as someone who matters.
But the way Brian goes about trying to achieve those things does not always work in his favor. His pretension can put people off. His self-righteousness can create distance. His inconsistency between who he says he is and who he actually is can erode trust over time. And the result is that Brian often finds himself on the outside of social situations, looking in, wanting to be more fully a part of them than he actually is. It is a pattern that echoes the larger identity struggle Brian has been carrying throughout this entire video. The feeling of being close to belonging, without ever quite arriving there. The social world of Quahog does not always welcome Brian in the way Brian hopes it will, and that repeated experience of being on the margins, of having his self-image challenged by the people around him, is one of the things that makes Brian's character feel so layered and so emotionally rich. It adds weight to everything else we have discussed, and it brings us to a place where we can step back and look at all of the pieces of Brian Griffin's character together, and ask what it all adds up to when you see the full picture. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Every pattern we have observed across this video, the contradictions, the insecurities, the searching, the coping, all of them come together in a final picture that is worth taking the time to sit with. Section 12. What Brian's behavior teaches us. We have spent a long time with Brian Griffin in this video. We have followed him through his contradictions and his insecurities, through his relationships and his failures, through his writing and his drinking, and his quiet, ongoing search for something that feels meaningful. We have looked at the way he carries himself in the Griffin household, and the way he carries himself in the wider world of Quahog. We have listened to the way he talks about himself and watched the way he actually behaves, and we have noticed, again and again, that those two things do not always match up. And now, after all of that, it is worth stepping back and looking at the full picture. Not to diagnose Brian, not to put a label on him or reduce everything he is to a single explanation, but simply to sit with what we have seen, to think about what it all means, and to ask what Brian Griffin's character teaches us about the kind of complexity that can exist inside a single person, even a fictional one, even one who happens to be a dog. The first thing that stands out when you look at everything together is how much of Brian's life is shaped by a single recurring tension. Brian wants to be seen a certain way. He wants to be seen as intelligent, as morally aware, as cultured and thoughtful and important. And he has worked very hard across many seasons of the show to build and maintain that image. He reads, he writes, he holds strong opinions. He positions himself as the smartest and most aware person in whatever room he is in. All of that effort, all of that investment in a particular self-image is real. Brian genuinely believes in the version of himself he has built. And yet, underneath all of it, there is a quieter and more uncertain version of Brian that does not always feel as confident or as solid as the one on the surface. The ego and the self-doubt live side by side. The intellectual confidence and the deep insecurity coexist. And the gap between the two of them is one of the most consistent and most defining things about Brian as a character. Living with that kind of internal tension, day after day, is not easy. It requires a constant amount of energy to keep the confident version of yourself facing outward while the less confident version stays hidden underneath. And Brian spends a great deal of energy doing exactly that across season after season of the show. That tension shows up in the way Brian relates to the people around him. It shows up in the way he approaches his writing, pouring so much of his identity into it that every failure in that area feels like a failure in his life as a whole. It shows up in the way he drinks, using the martini as a way of managing emotions he does not always want to face directly. It shows up in his relationships, where the insecurity that lives underneath his confidence makes it very difficult for Brian to let someone in fully, because letting someone in means risking the kind of hurt that Brian has already learned is possible. All of these behaviors, when you look at them together, are not separate things. They are connected. They are all different expressions of the same underlying experience, which is the experience of someone who is trying very hard to feel like he belongs and like he matters, and who is not entirely sure he has figured out how to do that. The way Brian handles his emotions is another thread that runs through everything we have discussed. Brian does not express what he feels in obvious or direct ways. He internalizes. He processes things quietly, often on his own, without drawing attention to the fact that something is going on inside him. When he is hurt, he does not always show it. When he is disappointed, he does not always talk about it. When he is lonely, he does not always reach out. This is not because Brian does not feel things deeply. He does. It is because the version of himself that Brian has built, the composed, intellectual, put-together version, does not leave a lot of room for vulnerability. And so Brian carries his emotions quietly, and sometimes the weight of that carrying becomes visible in small ways, in the way he holds himself, in the way he responds to things, in the moments where the composure slips just slightly, and something underneath shows through. That quiet carrying has a cost. It keeps Brian from fully processing what he feels, and it keeps the people around him from fully understanding what Brian is going through. It is a way of protecting himself that also, in its own way, keeps him from the kind of connection he is looking for. The relationship with Stewie is one of the places where that emotional life becomes most visible. And it is worth returning to here because of what it reveals about Brian's capacity for genuine connection. Brian and Stewie have built something between them that is real and deep and earned over a long stretch of the series. It is a relationship where Brian does not have to perform, where he can be seen more honestly than he allows himself to be seen in most other parts of his life. And the fact that Brian is capable of that kind of connection, that the guarded and self-protective version of Brian can soften enough to let someone in, tells you something important about who Brian is underneath all of the layers he has built on top of himself. The capacity for warmth and loyalty and genuine care is there. It has always been there. It just does not always get the space it needs to show itself. And the fact that it does show itself in certain moments, in certain relationships, is one of the most hopeful things about Brian as a character. The existential dimension of Brian's character adds another layer of depth to all of this. Brian is not just someone who is struggling with insecurity or trying to fit in or coping with the difficulties of his relationships. He is also someone who is genuinely grappling with questions about what life means and whether it has a purpose. Those questions sit underneath everything else Brian does, and they give his restlessness and his dissatisfaction a quality that goes beyond the ordinary frustrations of daily life. Brian is searching for something. He has been searching for a long time. And the search has taken him through his writing and his drinking and his relationships and his role in the family, and none of those things have given him a complete answer. The search continues, quietly, in the background of everything Brian does. And that is one of the things that makes him feel so persistently and genuinely alive as a character. There is a courage in that, in continuing to search for meaning even when the search has not given you what you hoped it would. And that courage is present in Brian even when it is not the most visible thing about him. The hypocrisy and the moral contradictions we examined earlier in the video are also worth returning to in this final reflection, because they are not just flaws in Brian's character. They are symptoms of something larger. They are what happens when someone has built a very specific and very idealized version of themselves, and then has to live in a world that does not always allow that version to hold up. Brian holds himself to a high standard. He believes in that standard genuinely, and yet the gap between the standard and the reality of how Brian actually lives is something that the show keeps returning to because it is one of the most honest things about him. It is not a cartoon villain flaw. It is not something that is there just to make Brian look bad. It is a deeply human quality, the quality of being imperfect in ways you do not always see in yourself,
and it makes Brian feel real in a way that a character without those contradictions simply could not. The animal instincts that surface from time to time, the flinch at the vacuum cleaner, the momentary loss of composure when something triggers a response that bypasses his rational mind. These moments do something important for Brian's character. Well, they keep him grounded. They keep him connected to what he actually is, underneath all of the sophistication and the intellectual posturing. They are small, quiet reminders that Brian is not entirely the character he has constructed, and that there is another layer to him that is older and deeper and less controllable. And those reminders, uncomfortable as they might be for Brian in the moment, add a dimension of honesty to his character that makes him feel complete. What all of this adds up to, when you step back and look at it as a whole, is a character study that is remarkably layered for an animated show. Brian Griffin is not a simple character. He is not just funny, and he is not just sad, and he is not just smart, and he is not just flawed. He is all of those things at the same time, and the way those things interact with each other is what creates the depth. The insecurity fuels the ego. The ego covers the insecurity. The search for meaning drives the writing and the relationships. The fear of vulnerability shapes the way Brian connects with other people. The role Brian plays in the Griffin family both gives him purpose and quietly wears him down. None of these things exist in isolation. They are all part of the same person, and they all influence each other in ways that make Brian's experience of the world feel textured and real and genuinely complicated. A psychologist looking at Brian Griffin would not arrive at a single, clean explanation for who Brian is or why he behaves the way he does. The picture is too layered for that, and the show is too honest about the complexity of Brian's character to allow for a neat conclusion. Brian is someone who is still figuring things out. He is still searching. He is still caught between the version of himself he wants to be and the version of himself he actually is. And the distance between those two versions has not closed by the end of this video. And it has not closed by the end of the series either. That is not a failure of Brian's character. It is the most realistic thing about him. People do not resolve their internal contradictions neatly. They live with them. They carry them. They keep going in spite of them, and sometimes because of them. And the fact that Brian does the same thing is one of the reasons he has stayed such a compelling and emotionally rich character for so long. Brian Griffin is a dog who walks and talks and reads and drinks and writes and worries and hopes and disappoints himself and keeps trying anyway. And in all of those things, in every one of those layers, there is something that feels genuinely, unmistakably human. That is what makes Brian Griffin one of the most psychologically interesting characters in animated television. And that is what we have been exploring together throughout this entire video. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.